Sorry guys, I wasn't sure if I was going to get this video to you in time. We've been busy building a bomb shelter because in case you've been living under a rock the size of Uluru, there is a US presidential election going on this week between former President Donald Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris. Just like every US election, this feels like a life or death vote, and honestly, I just want one US election where it doesn't feel like the apocalypse is going to start, depending on which box Americans tick. With Australian elections, it never feels like life or death the way it does in the States. And there are so many differences between the elections over here in Australia compared to America. So I want to take this time to get away from some of the craziness that's happening in politics, and let's talk about some of the differences between elections in Australia versus America. Grab a bicky, grab a cuppa, and let's get right into this video. First off, in Australia, voting is compulsory. You have to vote if you are a citizen of Australia, which is completely different from the States where voting is voluntary. In fact, that's one of the biggest problems when it comes to US elections is trying to get a decent enough turnout for elections. 2020, we reached record numbers of voter turnout, and we will be really interested to see what happens this year in 2024. Because billions of dollars are spent every single year on campaigning over in the States, trying to get voters to register, trying to get them out to the polls. Whereas in Australia, because it's compulsory, people have to turn out to vote. Which leads to difference number two. Because it's compulsory in Australia, if you don't vote, you get fined a whopping 20 bucks. That's right, if you just decide you don't want to show up for whatever reason, you are fined $20 for not voting in an Aussie election. In the States, because voting's optional, we don't get fined if we don't vote. The worst thing that happens is that you get scolded by your crazy political uncle at Thanksgiving, which, to be honest, if that's the worst thing they say, that's probably a good Thanksgiving. Now, since moving to Australia almost 3 years ago, I've seen an election and a referendum happen here, and this is my first US election where I've been voting abroad, and it's interesting to see some of the differences of where people vote. In Australia, there are open polling places all over. These could be schools, churches, community halls, certain public buildings. There are so many places that Aussies can just show up and vote. Whereas in the States, that's not really an option. In the States, you actually have one designated polling place nearby that you have to go to. And there are a lot of these. I remember going to community halls. I remember going to a fire station the last time I voted back home. But there are designated places that you have to go depending on the zip code and area that you live in the States. Whereas in Australia, you have options. You can stop by a certain church if they're open on the way to go grocery shopping. Or if you have to take somebody to soccer practice, you can go to one of the local high schools. Whereas in the States, you have one designated polling place that you have to go to on election day if you choose not to use a mail-in ballot. In Australia, there's a preferential voting system, whereas in the States, you're voting for just one candidate. Australia uses a preferential voting system, which they'd never use this in an American federal election, but there have been some local elections in the States where they've tried this out. You could argue about which is better. Let me know in the comments down below if you think preferential voting is actually a better system. But one of the biggest differences is how much is spent on elections. For instance, the 2022 election here in Australia cost taxpayers about $500 million. In the States, for 2020, the election cost $14.4 billion. Now, America is much larger. America is about 14 times the size of Australia's population. But even if you took that into account, $14.4 billion if we had the same size population. Now, one thing that a lot of Aussies tell me, which I wouldn't necessarily say is true, but is kind of true, is that here you're voting for a party, whereas in the States you're voting for a particular presidential candidate. Now, in Australia, they focus very much on who is running for Prime Minister, typically in the Labour and Liberal parties.
I don't like it.
So saying that you're not voting for a candidate is kind of true because Prime Ministers don't have to sit out their full term. A term for a Prime Minister here in Australia is 3 years, and if they're doing a poor job, their own party can kick them out and put somebody else in place. Whereas in the States, whoever we vote for, we are stuck for unless they pass away or decide to step down during office, in which case the vice president then takes over. So both countries set up the date of the election. For America, it is always the first Tuesday of the month every 4 years. That is the date of our presidential elections. Whereas in Australia, voting, whether it's for Prime Minister, for referendums, for whatever it is, voting is always on a Saturday here. There are more complex rules about when an election has to take place. I wrote this down and it's still a head scratcher. It is up to or before 68 days from the expiry of the House. To put it in plain terms, the House expires on a set date and the election has to happen within 68 days of the day that expires. So for 2025, which is when the next Prime Minister election is going to take place here in Australia, the House expires on the 22nd of July, which means the latest date that an election can happen here is the 27th of September. So one little quirk, one difference is democracy sausages, which if you're Australian, you automatically know what that is, and if you're American, it sounds like an innuendo for something on a politician who can't keep it in their pants. But democracy sausages are very much a part of Aussie voting election staples. What it is it's a sausage sizzle, which again, if you're American, probably sounds odd. But to Aussies, sausage sizzles are very common. Sausage sizzles are kind of like a mini barbecue that are set up for charity. On election days, these are set up near polling booths and basically just a chance to bring in a little bit of money and have something to eat while you are waiting to vote. In fact, it's so popular that there is actually a website that is dedicated to tracking where these are at on election day, so you can make sure that you pick a polling place that actually has democracy sausages available. On the one hand, I can't believe this is a thing, but also it's so Australian that it makes perfect sense. The biggest difference of them all, it's something that not a lot of Australians are well aware of, and it is something that is so extremely controversial and is very frustrating to the majority of Americans. And that is the Electoral College. So most Aussies are very surprised to hear that it's not actually the popular vote that decides the President of the United States. It is the Electoral College. Across all 50 states plus Washington, D.C., there are 538 electorates in total. And for a nominee to win, they have to secure at least 270 of these electoral votes. Each state is designated their own number of electorals, and this is based on the state's population. So there are states like California, Texas, and New York with the largest number of electorals. And you hear right around election time that a lot of candidates are focusing on swing states, and these are states that can either swing blue or red depending on how the majority of the population in that state votes. One of the difficulties with this is that most of the states have a winner-take-all when it comes to electoral votes. Say for instance, to make the math easy, because I'm not a numbers girl, Maryland has 10 electoral voters. If 60% of Maryland votes for Donald Trump and 70% votes for Kamala Harris, they don't split the votes up so that way Trump gets 6 votes and Kamala gets 4. No, it's a winner-take-all, so Trump would then get all 10 votes. And this frustrates a lot of Americans because in a lot of ways it feels like if you're not voting with the majority of the people in your state, then your vote essentially doesn't matter. In fact, you'll find a very popular rumor going around that there hasn't been a Republican who's won the popular vote in the last 30 years, although it's not actually true. In 2004, George Bush won the popular vote and the Electoral College. But the reason that Trump became president in 2016, even though he lost the popular vote, was because he won the Electoral College. And this isn't some conspiracy theory. You can completely Google the popular vote in 2016. Technically, Hillary Clinton won more votes, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College, which is how Trump became president in 2016. So it will be very interesting to see which way the election swings this year. I'm sure in the comments down below there are going to be so many people with so many opinions, so just please stay respectful. That is all I ask on this channel. So that's it for this video, you guys. I hope you liked it. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe button, and I will see you all in the apocalypse as I go and finish up my bomb shelter. Bye!